The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very, very important debate. Let me state from the outset, Mr. Speaker, that I understand completely the need for Canada to have the appropriate balance in monitoring communications, in collecting information that's important when it comes to our collective security. I say that, Mr. Speaker, because several years ago I was commencing a 3-week international visitor program into the United States, and my very first day of those 3 weeks was in Washington, which happened to be the morning of 9/11. And thus began my 3 weeks throughout America, and I learned a lot about security and the evolution of security thinking and apparatus on a continental and global basis. However, I think listening to the government views on this, and I've listened intently now for most of the day, I'd like to remind them, first of all, a lot of Canadians are deeply, deeply concerned and troubled by this. I have an international airport, the Ottawa Airport, in my district, Mr. Speaker. I've received many, many comments, many questions about what's going on in that airport as people fly in and out of our national capital, including, by the way, 65,000 foreign officials each and every single year. So this motion today is a simple one for Canadians who are watching, listening, or reading. It means simply that we would create an all-party committee here to oversee the activities of the Communications Security Establishment Canada. And this would be, of course, in keeping with what's already happening in other jurisdictions. A similar committee exists in the United States. One exists in the United Kingdom. One is in place in New Zealand. And yet another is operating in Australia. We're talking about having a fixed number of MPs sworn to secrecy, absolute secrecy, who would play an important role in terms of monitoring the activities of this particular organization, this agency, to make sure that, in fact, Canadians' paramount right, their collective paramount right to privacy, is in fact maintained and upheld. But as I listen to the government members respond to this, I'm perplexed. Mr. Speaker, only several years ago, all parties in this House came together in a report in 2004 and agreed. We all agreed, and in fact the government brought in legislation saying they would do precisely this, create an all-party committee. The Minister of National Defence today was a member of that committee who signed off and spoke perhaps most strongly in favour of actually doing this. So why is the government flipped in terms of its views in this regard? We've seen, as I've just explained, other jurisdictions who are doing this, partners who are working with Canada on a daily basis with respect to security matters. Why would the government resist this? In fact, if I could sum up the government's position, Mr. Speaker, it goes, I think, something like this. We actually want more secrecy, says the government, but we can't tell you why, because that's a secret. That's what we heard the Prime Minister say today during question period when he was asked precisely about this question. His answer was, I can't say anything about this because it's secret. That's not reassuring for Canadians. And I have to ask, where are all the conservative libertarians? Where are all the former police officers or the remaining lawyers in that caucus, Mr. Speaker, or military officers who all swore an oath to uphold the rule of law? Can they categorically look at each one of their constituents and say there's absolutely nothing wrong going on here when we know that there are committee reports that say, Houston, we may have a problem? They can't say that. Where are those voices? What's happened to those people? What's happened to that caucus? So, Mr. Speaker, it's deeply troubling to hear what the government is saying in response. You know, you'd think the Conservatives, and this Prime Minister in particular, would be in favour of improving oversight. You'd think so, Mr. Speaker, and here's why. Here's one incident to justify why they might be in favour. Let's all hearken back to the Iraq War. Let's all hearken back to the then Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, now Prime Minister, writing an open letter to major American dailies in New York City and Washington, attacking the Canadian government for not participating in the Iraq War. When the then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, made the right fact-based decision not to participate in the Bush War. You'd think, in contrast, knowing what we know now about the fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction, despite the assertions by the entire security apparatus of the United States, a construct and a fiction foisted on the world, which, by the way, decimated America's security reputation for the decade that followed. The point being, Mr. Speaker, I hear the former Minister of Defence asking for an answer. Let me explain to him. You'd think they would have learnt their lesson. They should be demanding more oversight. They should be demanding more information as parliamentarians, Mr. Speaker, so they don't, to put it in blunt terms, get sucker punched again. So, Mr. Speaker, it's quite astonishing to hear the government say that this is not a positive step for Canadians who are concerned. A part-time commissioner, a former judge. I know lots of judges. I know lots of former judges. I'm sure he's a good person, Mr. Speaker. A part-time judge is overseeing this entire apparatus. What's wrong with having a group of MPs sworn to absolute secrecy to make sure that this is properly monitored on behalf of the Canadians who elected us into this House to do the job? You know, Mr. Speaker, because there's no real answer forthcoming from the government, I don't want to see ghosts here, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians are very fair-minded, but because there's no real rationale except that it's all okay, it all works just fine, Canadians are going to conclude that maybe there's something wrong here. Maybe there is something being hidden by the Conservative government. Because the voices previously that spoke so strongly in favour of this are now all silenced. Former ministers of defence, current ministers of defence, former ministers of justice, all who have sworn to uphold the rule of law, all who know better. And there has to be a reason, because a man or a woman, Mr. Speaker, always acts for a reason. What I'd like to hear from the government sometime today is, what are the real reasons here? Why is it they are resisting setting in place a no-cost? The Minister of Finance is looking for low-cost or no-cost measures? Other than my bill to eliminate his partisan advertising, which is no cost, here's an idea that's no cost. Set up a committee of well-meaning, good-faith, hard-working MPs from all parties to give Canadians assurances that their communications in an airport establishment or elsewhere aren't being monitored and tracked. That's a reasonable ask by any party. It's a reasonable ask by any citizen, Mr. Speaker. Earlier we heard a parliamentary secretary say, well, why didn't you do it when you brought the bill in, you brought the construct in years ago? Well, it's interesting, Mr. Speaker. As President Clinton once said in a speech I was privileged to hear, knowledge is doubling every 18 months. And the pace of knowledge and the change in knowledge is actually accelerating. So for anybody in this House to think that the technology then is anything approximating the technology today, well, clearly they're not following trends. We couldn't do a quarter back then of what we can do today, Mr. Speaker, perhaps 10%. So given these changes and this rapid evolution in technology, I think it's incumbent on us to keep up with the times. And one of the ways to do that is to have an all-party committee that can transcend time, so to speak, and follow these developments, be briefed on a regular basis. What are the capacities now of the agency? No one here is attacking the agency or the goodwill, the good faith of the people who are working there. I'm sure we would all agree they're motivated by the desire to do right by Canadians, to follow within the four corners of the statute that empowers them to do what they're doing. But when Canadians hear about their communications being perhaps followed, monitored, and acted upon when they're inside airports, and the airports reveal, as the Ottawa Airport revealed to me, they knew nothing and have nothing to do with this, that's a problem, Mr. Speaker. And so for the life of us on this side, we cannot understand the resistance or the reluctance of the Conservative government not to want to make sure that Canadians' privacy is paramount, is protected today and going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The honourable member for Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his comments. I'd like to broaden the debate a little bit and ask him about the Canadian Border Services Agency, which was set up by a Liberal government in, I believe, 2003. And what we've seen over time is the expansion of its activities to where it now acts like a police force, conducts investigations, runs informers, and probably has a national security apparatus embedded within it. Yet this agency has no oversight mechanism, no complaint mechanisms, no way for the public to actually deal with the CBSA decisions. So I wonder whether the member would agree that this motion is also important for agencies like the CBSA and not just CSEC, so that we could look at making the CBSA more accountable to the public and making sure it also operates within the law.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Well, that's a very probative and important question, Mr. Speaker, but one I can't answer. I don't know whether the Canadian Border Services Agency is pursuing illegal activities. The member asserts they are. I don't know if that's the case. If he has evidence of such wrongdoing, he should perhaps bring it forward. This motion today deals with one specific security establishment, the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. And it speaks to it directly because we now have evidence. We have reports. We've heard that there are perhaps here activities that are going on that ought to be subject to scrutiny and, to the extent possible, to the light of day through an all-party committee of parliamentarians. But going forward, if there were similar challenges with other security apparatus in the country, this is something that should be debated on the floor of the House. Absolutely, without doubt.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member misunderstood my question. What I'm saying not is that I have evidence that CBSA does things which are illegal, but that when people have concerns about their activities, they have no way to lodge those concerns, and that we have, in fact, no parliamentary oversight body. So your motion today seems to narrow things to CSEC, and what I'm asking you whether you would think this committee might also look at some of the...
Order. Remind the member to direct the questions to the chair rather than to other members of parliament.
Also consider that this committee might be able to look at other agencies like the CBSA which do not have parliamentary oversight mechanisms.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, that's an important question and one I can't answer. I'm not in a position to answer. It's something that I'm actually pleased that he's raised here on the floor of the House, because it speaks to a wider responsibility of the House here to make sure that we have parliamentary oversight. But as I like to say to my 4 adult children, Mr. Speaker, in life sometimes the best way to start is to start. And what we're proposing here is to start with an all-party committee of MPs that can bring the important role of a parliamentarian to bear, all sworn to secrecy, to review these matters on an ongoing basis, so that we can transcend all technology developments as they occur, because they're happening much more rapidly than we ever thought they could. And there'll be more information coming forward over time. I just can't for the life of me understand why these Conservatives aren't standing up and embracing this. Given the culture of the Libertarians inside this caucus, the former peace officers, those who have sworn to uphold the law, well, you know, I shouldn't be surprised, Mr. Speaker. You have a Minister of Justice who, frankly, given his conduct here, may be subject to actually being removed from the Law Society of Upper Canada. I think you're making our case.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable parliamentary secretary. Short.